I remember. Does it work?
If I go home and hook everything up, it works.
Maybe one day you can look out of your
I'm planning on putting it on my own computer. What, Nate? We're late for band.
Hello, folks.
Oh, thank you, Lord. I thought I completely failed this. Did you I thought I failed. 100. Oh, here. I thought I failed.
Grab your absence folder.
Hmm?
Grab stuff out of your absence folder over there. The quiz. You got there after the end of class day. You can finish the quiz from yesterday.
I have to catch the bus.
Front of the folder. C. Front of the folder. Katie. Would you have to catch the bus?
Yeah.
So you're going to come in tomorrow during a free period and you're going to get this done.
Okay.
You have a free period tomorrow?
I can come up 7.
That's good. That'll work. We got some absences today due to soccer sectionals, so we'll work through that. Open up your slideshow from yesterday. Don't open the one I just shared with you. Yeah. I'll give that to you. We're going to finish up with Indian Removal Act, and then we're going to shift gears. If you were out yesterday, you should have Chapter 8 read for Friday. Chapter 8 read for Friday. Congratulations on a good year for you. No shame in that. You did good. All right? Congratulations. Awesome year. We're going to try to knock out topic 3, slideshow 3, and slideshow 4 today. We said that Jackson defied the court's ruling yesterday with the decision in what Supreme Court case did Jackson basically ignore and say Worcester versus Georgia, 1832. Mr. Marshall, according to President Jackson, President Jackson famously said, President Jackson famously said John Marshall has made his decision with Worcester v. Georgia. Let him enforce it. Jackson continued to proceed with removing the Native Americans from the southeast, forcing eventually the Trail of Tears, which will happen in 1838. And there you have it. The Trail of Tears will occur. Forced relocation of the Cherokee people would take place in 1838, winter of 38 and 39. About almost 16,000 Cherokees will be removed from their homeland, and a quarter of that number will die en route. They were heading west, okay, the height of winter. Many of the elderly, people in their 70s, 80s, and even some as old as in their 90s, were forced to walk this forced relocation on foot, under armed guard. There were soldiers there to basically make sure that this went smoothly. Thousands died on the voyage. Matter of fact, about 4,000 are going to be buried, literally buried, and there are trails across the American South here that kind of memorialize the deaths of the Native Americans who died on the Trail of Tears. And clearly, it's going to be called the Trail of Tears because of the sadness involved with the Native Americans, the Cherokee, and others being forced to leave their homelands after being there, quite literally, thousands of years. This was a hallmark of the Jackson presidency, this Indian removal and the subsequent Trail of Tears. Jackson, again, as I've stated numerous times this week and last, Jackson was not a friend to Native Americans, certainly wasn't a friend to African Americans, and the Trail of Tears is again evidence of that with this removal of Native Americans, despite the United States legal system and our Supreme Court siding with the Cherokee, saying they are entitled to their homeland and they are entitled to be their own rulers. Jackson.
London Delio to room 160. London Delio to room 160.
Jackson ignored it, and the subsequent Trail of Tears will happen. Let's look at the events after the Trail of Tears and the impact on Native American tribes. Not just Cherokees were affected. There were some other tribes, major tribes. The Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Muskogee, the Seminole were also forcibly removed. The Cherokee made up the bulk of the Native Americans, but these other tribes, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Muskogee, and the Seminole, are also going to be relocated. Seminole were a tribe inhabiting what state? What current state? Do you think? The Seminoles were inhabiting what current state? Think of Seminoles, college sports, and mascots. What? Oh, did you say Alabama? Dude, I'm going to slap you.
Yeah.
Okay. Florida State Seminoles. Florida State. So the Seminoles were from Florida. Okay? All right? Dude.
I don't know why I said that.
Dude, Crimson Tide. Alabama Crimson Tide. All right? Now, back to the outcome and back to the impact. This resulted in a massive loss of ancestral land, not to mention the loss of their culture. Okay, you had a massive loss of ancestral lands and way of life. After the Trail of Tears, these Native Americans that will survive the expedition across the continent will settle in what today is the state of Oklahoma, called the Oklahoma Territory then, and many of them that survive will live to see another event that will require them to pack up and leave later on, a generation later. So this is not a one-time thing for many Native Americans. Many Native Americans and their history and their experience with American settlers is going to be one of upheaval and relocating and upheaval and relocating and violations of treaties. And we said yesterday that they were placed in an area that was called a what? What were the names of the places that were reserved for Native Americans? Reservations. And that's absolutely where the word comes. This here, President Jackson, we are reserving this place for you. We are reserving this piece of land for you. And most Native Americans left incredibly sad. There wasn't much of a fight put up against the Trail of Tears, against the people who were there on the ground, on horseback also to make sure it happened. Nothing of note, nothing that would be successful. They were outnumbered, they were outgunned, and many of them were weak and feeble and elderly. And the people who died, most of the dying were very, very young and very, very old. I mention this to my 7th graders all the time. I imagine if you have grandparents living, or even your parents, if your parents are old enough, if your parents are elderly, imagine the government coming into your town and basically telling you, like, on a couple of days' notice, that you need to pack up all your gear and you need to basically hightail it out of here on foot under military escort. And think about, like, the people who you know in your life that are old and frail and weak physically. Would they be able to do a 900-mile trek on foot? No. And most of these people are going to lose the will to live on the way. A lot of the elderly will die quickly. If they don't die quickly, they will become very, very sick during the winter months and die, and same with children as well. There really weren't a lot of provisions for caring for the Native Americans on this march either. There wasn't a lot of medical care given. There wasn't a lot of what you would call housing provided. People were constantly on the move. The government was not going to set up housing and shelters for these people as they're forcing them west. So it's a stain on our nation's history. how the Cherokee and the other tribes were treated with this Trail of Tears. But it was kind of par for the course for Jackson's presidency and his treatment of Native Americans. Let's finish up by taking a look at the legacy of the Indian Removal Act. By 1840, so the next year, by 1840, very few Native Americans remained in the Southeast. Most of the tribes had been pushed west. Long-lasting impact on Native American communities. This is considered, as I mentioned, a dark chapter in our nation's history. There's no, you can't sugarcoat it. You can't spin this as positive, as a blessing for either America or for the Native Americans. Certainly Americans benefited from the Native Americans leaving in terms of land, in terms of resources. There was an awful lot of gold, there were an awful lot of minerals that would be located in a lot of these areas where Native American are going to be moved west, and American settlers are going to stay put and establish towns and cities and home fronts. But there's very little positive you can put on it for the Native Americans, and because of that, it's a dark chapter in our history. Certainly one of the dark chapters of Jackson's presidency, which we're talking about, Jackson's presidency. All right. Reflections, importance of upholding constitutional principles. Guys, if I could tell you one thing about this, the thing that I want you to be understanding is that our country, at least the judicial branch of government and the Supreme Court, our country made every effort to uphold the law, to include the Cherokee and to include the tribes in the Southeast with their decision in Worcester v. Georgia. So the judicial branch did the right thing. And what's important for me in talking about that is that the judicial branch upheld constitutional principles. The judicial branch will uphold constitutional principles. Hello, Mr. Farley. Yeah. Yep. Okay, thanks, bye. The importance of upholding constitutional principles. That constitutional principle that was violated here would be what? If Jackson refused to obey the Supreme Court decision in Worcester v. Georgia, what constitutional principle did he violate? Think S-O-P. Constitutional principle, S-O-P. If I give you the second word, it won't help. If I give you the first word, it absolutely will help. Separation.
Separation of powers.
Yeah. Clearly, Jackson and the executive branch did not abide by the decision made by the court. Had Jackson agreed to uphold the law, the Cherokees would never have left their homeland. So it also is going to underscore a reflection, the dangers of unchecked executive power. Jackson, because of this, strengthened the power of the presidency. He strengthened the power of the presidency. He made the presidency a branch of government that for a time is going to hold and wield more power than the other two branches. That is not in a constitutional system. That is not in our republic what should be happening. Those three branches of government should be co-what? Co-equal. Co-equal. And each branch of the government has the ability to check or limit the power of the other two. But clearly, if we learn from history, Jackson's power, he far exceeded the amount of power that, and because of that, okay, this will come back to haunt him. Jackson is going to be nicknamed, he's going to be mocked as King Andrew. He's going to kind of be mocked by his political enemies as King Andrew, and his policies as president are going to result in a new political party being established. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Another reflection on this is the ongoing struggle for Native American rights. This is going to mark probably the low point in American history for Native American rights, but it will also mean that after the Trail of Tears and after the deaths of 4,000 Cherokee, that Native American rights are going to become more at the fore, more at the center of the American legal system. Native Americans are going to be one of the last groups in our country, one of the last groups to obtain voting rights. Native Americans are going to be one of the last groups to obtain voting rights, but we're going to see after the Trail of Tears that there will be a renewed focus in a lot of people's minds on Americans' treatment of Native Americans, and things will start to improve gradually, not overnight, certainly not fast, but gradually things will start to improve as we approach the 20th century, the century of the 1900s. Things will start to improve ever so slowly for Native Americans. So a lot to learn about when we talk about learning from history and when we talk about the Jackson presidency. Jackson, let's shift gears, and if you guys could open up your next slideshow, which I shared with you earlier today, we're going to see the results of how Jackson's policies are going to open up the door for an opposing political party to enter the American fray. This topic, and this is slideshow number 4, we're going to talk about the rise of what we're going to call the Whigs. And the Whigs are going to be an opposing political party that's going to develop in opposition to Andrew Jackson. The name Whigs, and Jackson represents which political party? Jackson is a Democrat. The Whigs are going to take their name in the 1830s from an old English anti-monarchy party by the same name. Okay? So the Whigs are going to take their name from a group of people in England who would oppose the monarchy, who called themselves Whigs, and we're going to see if there's any question, you ever have a question, is who are the Whigs, what did they, these were people who opposed originally the monarchy in England, and because Jackson had assumed a lot more power than constitutionally he was entitled to, his political opponents are going to name themselves Whigs in kind of in honor of the anti-monarchist party that presided in England. All right, so the Whigs and the Democrats are going to be the two political parties that we're going to be looking at here in the 1830s. Now, Whigs and Democrats, let's talk about this for a second. Jackson's presidency, again, recap, he was controversial. He served from 1829 to 1837. Now, you'll bear in mind that Jackson is not in office when the Trail of Tears occurs. But Jackson certainly was responsible for the policies that will allow for the Trail of Tears to continue after he leaves office in 1837. There's no question that even though he's not in office, his policies are the result of the Trail of Tears. We'll talk about his successor today, okay, who comes after Andrew Jackson as the 8th president. Jackson expanded presidential power, especially through vetoes. Now, somebody here last week, I think it was you, Alyssa, somebody asked me how many times Jackson completed vetoes in office, and we said there were dozens. I believe it was over 100 times in his 8 years in office that he vetoed a bill passed by Congress. Palin.
I remember looking at it. I thought it said it was 12 online. I don't know if it was like, I don't know. I just remember looking it up.
All right, so let's take a look here. When in doubt, let's use our tools. How many vetoes did Jackson use? All right, so let's take a look. Well, you did, and I stand corrected. It was 12, but not. See, oh, you know what the statistic was that that kind of got me thrown off? We read in one of our slides that Jackson had vetoed more bills than all the previous 6 presidents before him. So if you look at the 6 presidents before him on this chart, take a look at this. Okay, you've got Monroe vetoed 1, Madison vetoed 7, and George Washington vetoed 2. So that's a total of what? 10, and indeed Jackson did veto more. However, don't let the fact that Jackson vetoing only 10 bills, don't let that give you the impression that there weren't a lot of opposition. Jackson, if he wasn't vetoing bills, he certainly was opposing bills as they were being promoted and as they were being pushed through Congress. So in that sense, his critics called him King Andrew. His critics called him King Andrew because they were mocking him. If Congress passes a bill, okay, if Congress passes a bill, the House passes a bill, and then the Senate passes a bill, it needs to go to the president to sign it for it to become what? A law. If the president vetoes a bill, what's Congress's authority after that point? If Congress really wants something to become law and the president vetoes it, what's Congress's only option, Palin? They can override it with what percentage of the vote? No, a simple majority will pass it, but a 2/3 majority will override it. Meaning, if Jackson vetoed 12 bills, if Congress come back each time with at least 2/3 of the House and at least 2/3 of the Senate to support the passage of the bill, then Jackson's veto wouldn't matter. It would be automatically overridden. That did not happen. That did not happen. Critics called him, again, King Andrew. He was seen by his critics as somebody who abused power, who power was exceeded, and that's going to be a tough. It's going to be a tough nickname, and it's going to be a tough reputation for him to live down. Jackson, if TV and radio existed in 1829, 1830, and we had Jackson on camera, and we had Jackson maybe speaking to the press, or we had Jackson like we do today with our politicians, Jackson might have been described as a blowhard, somebody who talked loudly, somebody who talked very confidently. They would call him cocky. They would call him, because they disagree with him, they might call him, you can call him a bully. Jackson was very opinionated and very super confident. Okay, to a point where he made enemies very easily. Now, I don't think the parallels are too obvious, but can you think of a politician today that tends to talk loudly and tends to be very opinionated and tends to either have a lot of people love him or at the same time a lot of people hate him? Can you think of anybody like that? Sure, I can. I can think, not just him, but there's plenty. There's plenty. And he's a politician, Jackson, that his supporters really loved him, and his opponents really hated him. I mentioned a word at the beginning of the lesson last week. What did we say Jackson's presidency could be characterized by? What word? P word. Jackson was a very blank individual. I know I wrote this down. He was polarizing. He was very polarizing. Meaning you either loved him or hated him. There was very few people who were kind of in the middle on Jackson. And you mentioned Trump. There's very few people in the middle on Trump. He is cut from the same cloth as Jackson, I think, in terms of demeanor and in terms of his support and his detractors. And Trump probably more so because of our media now is 24/7. It's almost impossible for politicians to have quiet moments or personal moments. The fact that we have so much coverage of presidential candidates and of elected officials, I think it's a lot easier for politicians to become loved or hated today than it was then. Most Americans during the election of 1828 and 1832, most Americans didn't wake up every day thinking about national politics. Most Americans woke up thinking about local issues in their community. Most Americans didn't wake up every day and think, oh shucks, today my president's Andrew Jackson, I feel really good. People understood what it meant to be an American, but as I said earlier, most people connected and related much more to their location, their state, even their town, than they recognized themselves as Americans. But Jackson is going to start to change that when Jackson starts opening up voting rights to more and more white citizens. All right, question, Dylan? Okay, all right. Let's go on. Opposition to Jackson. All right, so here's where it gets fun. Okay, we're looking at the rise of the Whigs. So many groups opposed Jackson's policies and his leadership style. Okay, Jackson, you got to remember, he was an outsider. When he ran as president the first time, when he was elected, he was running against the National Bank. He was running against a lot of the establishment politicians who were Federalists. Many groups opposed him because of his political leadership style. These opponents began to organize politically. Okay, so he's a Democrat. Jackson is a Democrat. Okay, many of his opponents began to organize politically, and they're going to form a new party that is going to be called the Whigs. Again, taking their name from an old English party that kind of was anti-monarchy, and the Whigs are going to create the opposition to Andrew Jackson. Now, at first, the opposition is relatively weak. They don't have a lot of say during the first term of his presidency. They don't really have a lot of say in the second term of his presidency. But as Jackson gets to the end of his term, his second term, the Whigs are going to emerge as a very, very powerful opposition party. And it's the second time in our country's history, and I'm going to quiz you here right now, Honey. You're getting this question, Joe. All right? This is the second time in America we are going to see a two-party system, meaning two parties opposing each other. We got the Whigs and the Democrats now, okay? We got the Whigs and the Democrats in the 1830s. Anna, what were the first two? Say again? Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, that's right. Okay, so the Whigs and the Democrats are going to emerge in the 1830s, and the old political opponents are going to be the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Okay, so this is important. We live and have always really operated as a two-party system, where both parties kind of serve to balance the other out and keep the other party in check. Now, yes, there are more than two political parties. Today, literally in America, there are dozens of political parties. But generally speaking, throughout American history, there have always been two major political parties, both kind of representing distinct and oftentimes opposite differences and opposite views. So this here is going to be what we see develop during the presidency of Andrew Jackson. The Whigs are going to start to take up an opposing view to combat the Democrats and to combat what they see in Jackson is him exceeding his authority, acting too much like a king, being too much like a monarch. They're going to really mobilize. And oftentimes that's what has to happen for political opposition to grow. Politicians, oftentimes when they abuse power, politicians when they exceed their authority, politicians when they promote policies that the American people don't want, oftentimes that's going to result in a swelling, a growth of opposition, a swelling of opposition. And this happened before you were, well, you guys were very, very young when this happened, but in 2010, when President Obama was president, he had a very unpopular piece of legislation that was passed, literally by one vote in the Senate. It was called the Affordable Care Act, which has been nicknamed Obamacare, a health care plan. And the law passed, and it became the law, and it remains the law today. But the opposition to Obamacare helped actually spur the growth of a new political party. Does anybody know what the name of that party was in 2010 that kind of aligned to oppose President Obama and his Obamacare initiative? It was called the Tea Party, okay, in honor of the Boston Tea Party of hundreds of years ago, the Tea Party of 2010, which were made up largely of Republicans and conservatives who opposed a lot of President Obama's laws that were passed under his administration. So when politicians are hated and their policies are hated, that oftentimes results in the emergence of new political parties. And we're seeing that here in the 1830s with Jackson and the rise of the Whigs. Again, they called themselves Whigs because that was the name of a party in England way back when that opposed the monarchy. So they're going to call themselves Whigs in opposition or in paying respect to that. All right, so the birth of the two-party system. The birth of the second two-party system. And by second two-party system, it's exactly what we talked about. Okay? it's exactly what we talk about. We've got the birth of the second two-party system. The Whig Party opposed the Democratic Party of Jackson. This created the second two-party system. The first was the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, who a large number of them would have been, as Anna pointed out, they would have been anti-Federalists. So the first are going to be the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The second are going to be the Whigs and the Democrats. What are the two major parties today? We have two. We have more than two, but what are the two major? Republican and Democrat. Republican and Democrat. Joe Biden today is the president. He represents, he's the leader of the Democratic Party. And President Trump, who's running for president, as the candidate for president, you could say that Trump is the leader of the Republican Party in the nation. But back then, we got the Whigs opposing the Democrats. All right. Let's take a look at our author's clip on this. Our Ed Puzzle video on Democrats versus Whigs. This is a good little video I found that shows the differences between the two parties. That's not the one I want. So let's do this. Let's do this.
The one-party system that characterized Monroe's presidency gave way to a two-party system under Jackson. Supporters of Jackson were now known as the Democrats, while supporters of his leading rival, Henry Clay, were called the Whigs. First, a quick recap of the previous parties. First, we had the Federalists, founded by Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, founded by Thomas Jefferson. We know the Federalists disappeared because of the Hartford Convention after the War of 1812, and the Democratic Republicans held on throughout the era of good feelings. Then, after the election of 1824 and all these calls of intrigue and the corrupt bargain, the Democratic Republicans split into two. The National Republicans, which is a very, very short-lived group that surrounds itself around John Quincy Adams.
Which president did the National Republican Party surround itself with? Monroe, Madison, Andrew Jackson, or John Quincy Adams? John Quincy Adams.
And the Democratic Party, which Martin Van Buren helps form around Jackson.
Which president helped to form the Democratic Party? James Madison, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, or Henry Clay? Democratic Party. Andrew Jackson. He's going to represent the Democratic Party. And the party was actually created by someone who would become president after him, and that's Martin Van Buren. Okay, Martin Van Buren.
The National Republicans are quick to disintegrate, and eventually we have the Whigs that take their place.
Did I miss that question?
And the Democratic Party, which Martin Van Buren helps form around Jackson.
So Van Buren established it around Jackson, but Jackson is president when it happens. Van Buren's not the choice up there, so actually James Madison did not establish the Democratic Party. It's going to be Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, who is going to become president after Jackson leaves office. Okay.
The National Republicans are quick to disintegrate, and eventually we have the Whigs that take their place. Which leads us to Democrats versus Whigs. The Democrats harked back to the old Republican Party of Jefferson, while the
Whose ideas did the Democrats represent from a previous era? Hamilton's Federalists or Jefferson's Democratic Republicans? Jefferson's Democratic Republicans are going to represent the bulk of the beliefs of the Democrats, yes.
While the Whigs resembled a lot of the defunct Federalist party of Hamilton. However, they still were different from their predecessors.
Which party did the Whigs resemble from a previous era? Hamilton's Federalists or Jefferson's Democrat Republicans? Hamilton's Federalists. Good.
The major things the Democrats were in favor of is, one, they favored states' rights, including being pro-slavery. 2, they wanted a limited federal government who, for the most part, should not intervene with the economy. So, for example, they wanted free trade, no tariffs, no monopolies, no banks, nothing like that. But they did feel the government should play a role in some certain instances. Normally,
So we know Jackson opposed the Bank of the United States because he felt that it lacked the constitutional authority. He felt the bank did not have, nowhere in the Constitution did it specify that the country could establish a national bank. So this is going to be consistent with Democratic views. They oppose the national bank. They oppose the national bank, and they oppose government interference with trade. Okay?
to make sure that things remained equal. So, for example, they felt the government shouldn't intervene to make sure that the government should intervene to make sure there were no elites to attack centers of corruption, including paper money. They supported hard money, and even more importantly, they felt that the government should ensure equal opportunities, both political and economic, for white males. Lastly, they felt the government should intervene to defend the Union, which was essential for economic growth. And
Which of the following would Democrats from this era support? Again, we're talking about Jacksonian Democrats. Would they support a centralized government-run bank? Would they support high tariff rates? Would they support the adoption of paper currency? Or would they support the elimination of property requirements for voting? You say all say property requirements for voting. Who we spent the last 8 days talking about that basically that's one of his major beliefs? Jackson. Okay, good.
and for the country to exist. Both Democrats and the Whigs were national parties in the sense they garnered votes from across the U.S. The key defining characteristic of Democrats was they tended to be people who had been hurt or bypassed by the market revolution. They generally were not as wealthy as the Whigs. So in the South, this meant small farmers, people with few slaves, people who didn't engage in that market activity. In the North, same sort of thing, small farmers, workers, small businessmen, small merchants, again, people that didn't benefit from the market revolution. In the West, generally it was people with Southern roots who favored predominantly agrarian economy, who opposed developments of powerful economic institutions, meaning they were against the bank, and even sometimes against commercial agriculture.
You guys all understand what the
Lastly, cultural
BUS stands for? Bank of the United States. Okay.
minorities would actually wind up favoring the Democrats. We will discuss why later on. On the other hand, the Whigs were in favor of, even though they had formed because they resented Jackson's abuse of power, the key tenet of the Whigs was an active government for economic progress. They favored expanding the federal government's involvement in the economy in order to have economic progress, both industrial and commercial development.
So, what would the best example of this be that we have talked about? If the Whigs are going to be really the party of Henry Clay, what did Clay propose that supports this idea of an active government that was designed to help with economic progress throughout the entire country? What was that three-legged stool we talked about? The American system. So this would be absolutely something that the Whigs would support. The Bank of the U.S., the infrastructure spending for all three parts of the country, and what was the third leg? Tariffs. Okay.
They also felt that the best way to do this was through Clay's American system, meaning a national bank, which printed out money, federal funding of improvements, and a protective tariff. They viewed it as a way of joining the country together into a consolidated economic system. Many Whigs, in their support of an active government, also felt the government had to play a role in morality. For example, they were against slavery and Jackson's treatment of the Native Americans. They felt it was the government's job to oppose violence and crime and anything that caused it. They were therefore part of most of the reform movements during this time: abolition, women's rights, temperance, meaning against alcohol, and a lot of the violence they blamed on immigrants, hence why many cultural minorities voted Democrat.
Which of the following would a typical Whig oppose in this era? Legislating morality, using federal tax revenue to fund internal improvements, low tariff rates, or Henry Clay's American system. What would they oppose? Low tariff rates. You are correct. Low tariff. They want the American system. They want to use federal tax dollars to improve roads, highways, etc. And they want to legislate morality. They want people to be thinking about the right and wrong of slavery, the right and wrong of how Native Americans were treated. Good.
So who was a Whig? At first, a Whig was just those who opposed Jackson. The great triumvirate of opposition was first Henry Clay. He hated Jackson because of Jackson's denial of his American system. John Calhoun over personal resentment and nullification. And Daniel Webster hated Jackson over the bank. So these three together, they start the Whig Party, again, because they hate Jackson. But eventually it becomes more disciplined and more inclusive of the average person. So eventually they become more defined. The key defining characteristics of Whigs was they tended to be people who had been affected by the...
We'll finish up the video clip tomorrow.